Good evening, students. This is Professor Zeno talking to you through a screencast. My apologies for not being able to be there tonight due to parent-teacher conferences, but it must be nice also to get a break as well from having to come into class. We're going to do the lecture through the screencast. I'll have questions throughout. I would like you to have those questions submitted, or the answer to the questions submitted to me by 11:59 on this night, which will be Thursday, November 15th. So please make sure you submit the questions and the answers by the end of the night. I wrote down everything I'm going to say to you, so it's going to sound a little bit more like a story that I'm telling you rather than our lectures, which would be a back and forth dialogue. So thank you for your patience and for bearing with me. So we're looking at memorials, commemorations, and transitional justice this evening. We'll start with the introduction. The year 2015 was full of commemorations. It was 100 years after the Armenian genocide, 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, and 20 years after the genocide of Srebrenica. All three events are referred to as genocides, and all three events are remembered in the form of memorials. The purpose of memorials. Memorials portray pain and suffering, sometimes figuratively, sometimes abstractly. They provide a place for public commemorations and quiet mourning. They seek to link the past to the present through continuously retelling what once happened, and they serve as a reminder of people lost and pain endured. Post-conflict memory landscapes embed and convey meaning and are thus inexorably linked to the legacy of the conflict, to the struggles over interpretations about the violent past, and to the sites where remembering takes place. Constructing memorials after atrocities have become an important aspect of coming to terms with these atrocities, and thus forms a central component of transitional justice. Memorials, and commemoration more generally, are a more recent acquisition in the repertoire of dealing with the past. And even though memorials have been around for a long time, connecting them to more constructive ways of coming to terms with the past and promoting their establishment as part of transitional justice processes in post-conflict societies is a relatively new phenomenon. The key concepts. What is a memorial? Memorials are material or virtual objects which serve to represent events or persons who should not be forgotten. Memorials and their connection to transitional justice. In the context of transitional justice, the latter mainly refers to victims of human rights abuses during wars, ethno-political conflicts, repressive dictatorships, terrorist attacks, apartheid, as well as genocides. The main objectives are based on a number of political and ethical assumptions, such as providing an adequate site for mourning, holding perpetrators accountable, vindicating the dignity of victims, putting past wrongs right, and contributing to reconciliation. Memorials often employ a common aesthetic language communicating a key message, which is always, we must not forget. It is important to note, though, that memorials can never be an accurate replica of the past, but only offer a particular interpretation of the event, which may be contested or subject to change over time. Nevertheless, they seek to fix and store the representation of the atrocity through turning it into a monument that prevails and is available to future generations, often with the intention to educate the youth, and in doing so, to prevent the reoccurrence of the atrocity. Never again is thus the maxim of many sites, which we have talked about with other transitional justice mechanisms. In this sense, memorials exist in the present to tell us something about the past while seeking to affect the future, just like other transitional justice mechanisms. Memorials may be material and tangible, but they are often increasingly virtual and web-based, allowing for the participation of a larger group of activists in different geographic locations. There are three forms of material memorials. They can be authentic sites at the places where the atrocities have occurred. They can be constructed sites, which may be anywhere and are often more abstract and conceptual. Or they can be activities such as commemorations and peace marches. A number of different actors may initiate memorial sites. These range from civil society initiatives to the national governments or international organizations. Erecting memorials such as the murals in Belfast, Northern Ireland, or on Cairo's Tahrir Square in Egypt can be spontaneous and inexpensive, rendering it a suitable tool for community action. The process, however, can also be slow if different parties involved, including different groups of victims, struggle over the form of and the meaning portrayed by the memorial. So, for example, the memorial to the murdered Sinti and Roma of Europe, murdered under the National Socialist regime, was inaugurated in 2012 in Berlin after 20 years of intense debate about its message and aesthetic form. In terms of symbolic reparations, memorials are often referred to as symbolic reparations, in contrast to material reparations, such as financial compensation, which we have talked about in class. This ties in with an increasing focus of norms on victims more generally, such as expressed in basic principles put forth by the United Nations. Recent truth commissions, such as in Liberia and East Timor, have included the quest for memorials in their recommendations, alongside other mechanisms such as prosecution or institutional reform. Importantly, the way the past is depicted in a memorial depends on the particular experience of violence. After dictatorship and political repression, where violence was mainly top-down and exercised by the government, in many cases a culture of impunity prevails, and information about the whereabouts of the disappeared remains concealed. In such a scenario, memorials often point at the absence of the individual, and where possible, lobby groups or victims' associations construct them at authentic places such as prisons or torture centers. So, for example, Robben Island, a former prison where Nelson Mandela was held during apartheid, was created as a memorial site after apartheid. Ethno-political conflicts where violence occurred between two social groups, in contrast, often either lead to the construction of memorials that reinforce the division of the society by claiming exclusive victim status, such as the Avkara Memorial Center in Vukovar, Croatia, or to attempts to foster some form of mutual understanding and potential future reconciliation, as exemplified by the Sierra Leone Peace Museum. If violence took on an extreme form to the point of annihilation, such as in the case of genocides, memorials often portray shock and horror, such as in many Rwandan memorials, and also on the Cambodian killing fields through displaying human remains, including bones and skulls. One strategy here is to emphasize the enormity of the crime and the magnitude of the destruction. Transitional justice and memorialization. I spelled the wrong word up there. My apologies. Mechanism to deal with the violent past. It's not surprising that memorials have entered the field of transitional justice as potential mechanisms to deal with the legacy of the violent past. So let's do a little bit of a historical overview. Since 1970s and the 1980s, there has been a memory boom, in particular regarding the commemoration of the Holocaust and World War II, leading to what has been termed the memory imperative. Remembering has become a duty. This coincides with the important shift in the culture of remembrance away from commemorating war heroes who supposedly testified to a nation's strength and invincibility, such as depicted in memorials to fallen soldiers or to veterans. So more recently, there's been a focus in on victims, chief carriers of the moral weight regarding the atrocities committed, have become the focus of the attention of commemorations. This is, for instance, central to the rising number of memorials built in the shapes of so-called walls of names, such as at the Potokari Memorial in Srebrenica, Bosnia, or walls with photographs, such as at the Kigali Memorial Center in Rwanda, or the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Cambodia. Through naming and depicting victims, they are identified as individuals, preventing their submersion into an anonymous and amorphous mass of people killed. The intention of naming is to give them back some dignity. In terms of transitional justice and memorialization, transitional justice, too, has in recent years strengthened to focus on victims, leading to its almost natural conversion with the field of memory studies. In its initial phase, the focus was mainly on perpetrators in order to identify and hold them accountable, not at least due to a strong focus on criminal prosecution. At present, victims are increasingly identified as target audiences of transitional justice as well as its agents. So there's been a shift from the concrete to the abstract. Parallel to the inclusion of victims in the memorial processes, the aesthetic form of some memorials has changed, giving way to a new memorial culture. There's been a shift away from figurative depictions of strong heroic persons or national symbols set in solid stone such as marble or granite and leaving no room for interpretation, to more conceptual sites which encourage onlookers to think and reflect. Instead of dictating one particular interpretation of past events, they invite one to form their own opinion, in a sense liberating and democratizing remembrance. It is no longer the initiators or artists who dictate memory, but visitors may draw on their own personal experience to create meaning. Considering that memorials often make reference to repressive dictatorships, this form of liberating the mind is an important symbolic yet highly political step. These more recent sites avoid solid structures and employ water features, with still water serving as a mirror to reflect visitors and the sky, as in the State War Memorial in Perth, Australia, or running water pointing to the moving of time, such as at the 9/11 Memorial in New York. Gardens also serve as places for seclusion and reflection. For example, the Sharpeville Memorial Garden or the Kigali Memorial Center in Rwanda. Open spaces inviting opening minds, and narrow spaces transmitting the claustrophobic experiences of death and destruction. Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, a gap in the ground reminiscent of an open wound, or Peter Eisenman's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, which consists of 2,711 narrowly assembled concrete blocks, serve to illustrate this trend. And in and of themselves, these sites have no symbolic significance, which links them to the atrocities. It's the personal experience and the interpretation of the visitor that matters. In the context of transitional justice, memorials fulfill different functions, which, at the far end of the spectrum, may lead to a better understanding between the conflicting parties and an increase of knowledge about or acknowledgement of the crimes committed on one side, or a perpetuation of the division between the parties and the politicization of remembrance on the other. Regarding their positive impact, first, they may serve to reestablish the dignity of the victims through offering a gesture of symbolic reparation. This carries the message that individuals or groups are now accepted and respected by their respective society. In cases where victims were persecuted due to their faith or race or ethnic belonging, sexual orientation, or political views, publicly acknowledging this aspect affirms their part of their identity. Second, memorials have the potential to stimulate public debates about the crimes committed, including discussions about their causes and the consequences, and in some cases also about the conditions to which victims of these human rights abuses are subjected at present, such as continued discrimination and marginalization. They may turn into sites of conscience at which various interest groups can influence ongoing discussion and stimulate civil engagement to prevent similar atrocities being committed in the future. This may be of great significance for societies in transition. And third, from the perspective of transforming the conflict that caused the human rights abuses, it is occasionally intended that the memorial contributes to improving the relationship between the conflicting parties and to some form of rapprochement between them. Some memorials provide spaces for encounter where people affected can share their experiences and views about past events in order to reduce divisions and strengthen commonalities. This is something linked to promoting a form of memory which contributes to nation building, which is extremely important after conflicts when trying to establish a democracy. As to the sites of resistance, so far the function of memorials in the context of transitional justice has been portrayed in a rather positive way. Yet, how about the situation in which the suffering of victims of human rights abuses is not publicly known or is even subject to denial? In these cases, memorials are sites of resistance to a culture of impunity and function as exclamations to draw attention to what is silenced. For effective groups, this is often an important element in times of transition. As to sites where contestations are fought, moreover, since the interpretation of the past may be contested by the parties to the conflict, memorials may turn into sites over which this contestation is fought out. And finally, to sites of bereavement and reflection. In addition to these public functions of memorials, they also serve a deeply private purpose as sites of bereavement and reflection. For those left behind, they may turn into spaces where they feel close to their deceased or disappeared loved ones. So taking care of commemoration sites may then turn into a ritual which helps with the personal grieving process, similar to looking after the grave of a loved one. Bearing these functions in mind, it's important to remember why memorials need to be constructed in the first place. Now we're going to look at a specific case study of a memorial that was put forth after a conflict and a genocide. We're going to look at the Srebrenica Potočari Memorial Center. The Dayton Peace Accord marked the end of the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the beginning of a transition to peace and justice. How to deal with the atrocities committed during the war and how to address calls for justice has become contested in this deeply divided society of Bosnia and Herzegovina. To acknowledge past sufferings, rehabilitate the dignity of victims, and support personal grieving processes, a number of memorials has been erected. The largest and perhaps most renowned of them is the Srebrenica Potočari Memorial Center outside the small town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia-Herzegovina. Constructed to commemorate the genocide that took place there in July 1995, when more than 8,000 men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces. The purpose is to address the absences brought about by sudden and violent killings, the losses of the embodied presence, participation in everyday life and relationships, emotional equilibrium among the bereaved people, and ultimately the memory of someone who once lived. So let's talk a little bit about this history. During the 1992 to 1994 war, the town of Srebrenica was under siege. Due to the imminent threats against its population, it was designated by the UN as one of the 6, quote, safe areas in Bosnia-Herzegovina and was protected by 400 Dutch peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers. As a consequence, many Bosniaks sought refuge in the town to escape the ethnic cleansing that took place in eastern Bosnia-Herzegovina and the town's population increased dramatically. In 1995, the town was taken over by Bosnian Serb forces, and many fled to the UN camp a few kilometers away in the village of Potokari. There, the UN peacekeepers watched as Europe's largest single war crime since World War II was committed. After being separated from their families by Bosnian Serb forces, some 15,000 men and boys fled through the woods, trying to reach the town of Tuzla and the territory controlled by the Bosnian army. The flood of Bosniaks out of Potokari has been called the Journey of Death, and Potokari became the site of the only war crime in Europe that has been defined as a genocide since the Holocaust. In terms of the controversy, today the town hosts the largest memorial in Bosnia-Herzegovina in what is now the Serb-led entity Republika Srpska. The construction of the Srebrenica Potokari Memorial Center was contested from its inception. The first commemoration, organized by a small group of surviving family members, mostly women, was held on July 11, 1999, when they gathered in Potokari and held a funeral service for the killed and missing. The materialization of the memorial was largely influenced by the determined efforts of victim advocacy groups such as the Mothers of Srebrenica, and followed by the support of international actors. Victims and survivors of the genocide fought hard for the memorial to be built in Srebrenica itself. Yet, fierce opposition came from the nationalist Bosnian Serb political elite, of whom many denied the genocide, of course, and obstructed the processes, and demanded such a memorial to be erected in the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, where Bosniaks today are the majority. In the year 2000, after years of contestation, the High Representative Wolfgang Petrischt used his executive powers to place the memorial outside of Srebrenica at the Potokari base, in accordance with the views of the victims and the survivors of the genocide. The memorial was finally inaugurated by the then U.S. President Clinton on September 20th, 2003. In terms of the construction, the memorial complex is composed of 3 parts. It is housed at the Battery Factory Potokari, which was used as the base by the Dutch battalion Dutchbat, but which is now reconstructed as a museum space hosting the memorial room. The second part of the complex is the cemetery. The cemetery includes a memorial wall where the names of the victims buried in the cemetery following the July 1995 genocide are inscribed. The number of killed and buried marks the number of killed and buried marks the entrance of the cemetery. Quote, 8,372 is inscribed on a block of marble, followed by an ellipse indicating that this figure is not final, as there are people still missing and unidentified. So far, 5,500 victims have been buried at the cemetery, each with a personalized tombstone with the name and birth of the year of the dead and a phrase from the Quran. A single wooden cross stands out at the grave of a Catholic inhabitant of the town who was killed during the genocide and was thus buried in the cemetery in 2010 when his remains were recovered. The third part of the complex is the hall. The hall, where approximately 4,000 refugees stayed for 2 days in July 1995 under deteriorating conditions, is dreary and depressing, cold and empty, except for 2 large black cubic constructions situated opposite each other in the middle of the building. In one of the 2 cubic spaces, there are 20 personal narratives displayed with a photo, a short life story, and 1 personal belonging of a victim who is buried or still missing. These narratives reveal that it was not only combatants who were killed, as the stories include old men and children who could not have been combatants. In the other cubic space, a 30-minute documentary, A Cry from the Grave, by Mohamed Mujic, a filmmaker from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and British director Leslie Woodhead, is screened. The film provides a reconstruction of day-to-day events preceding and following the Srebrenica's fall. It's based on the recordings made by the exhumation of mass graves, testimonies of the surviving families, testimonies of the Dutch peacekeepers, as well as original video recordings from July 1995. The row of pictures and posters with quotes, maps, and court verdicts on the walls of the hall provide a framework to the narratives presented in the documentary and the personal stories on display. And what I'd like you to do, as for question number 1, is I would like you to look up the Srebrenica Putkari Memorial Center and upload a picture of the museum, the cemetery, and the hall to a Word document as question number 1. In terms of stimulating public debate and awareness to prevent reoccurrence by emphasizing victimhood. Apart from attempting to preserve the memory of genocide and define it as a site of memory, the purpose of the memorials is also to prevent similar atrocities from happening again and reinforce the moral imperative of never again. The Education and Research Center aims to educate the public so that this will never happen again. And in terms of a peace march, the Srebrenica Putkari Memorial Center is also central to the 3-day commemorative peace march, an annual event that begins on the morning of July 8th near a field in the village of Nezuk. The participants retrace the 110-kilometer trek made by a column of 15,000 Bosniak men and boys making their way through the hills, valleys, woods, and villages where the column was ambushed and cut off. There were some 6,000 men and boys out of over 8,000 victims in total perished en route to safety. It is a march to commemorate their suffering and their courage that ends at the Srebrenica Putkari Memorial Center. Some survivors from the original trek, Bosniaks of all generations, men and women, boys and girls, join the ranks, as do international tourists from